Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very, very fascinating presentation ahead of us. You know, Judaism is very good at walking contradictions, at oxymorons. We've always discussed the interface of faith and reason. And how in Judaism, faith and intellectual rationalization are not contradictions, but they actually strengthen and support one another. And so as we look back to try to analyze past events, the fact that everything is with divine providence, and the fact that it's almost impossible to discern with certainty why things happen, especially an event as huge as the Holocaust. Reasons for the Holocaust, of course, the Holocaust defies any type of explanation or rationalization. But that doesn't preclude our investigations and our study of possible streams within society and the world that we can learn from in terms of the future. And so it's not that we're trying to justify, God forbid, or find some comfortable explanation. There are no comfortable explanations. But it is incumbent upon us to study history so that we could discern those lessons that we can take forward and take with us into the future. So today we have an esteemed author who did some incredible research on this subject, this painful subject of the Holocaust. His name is Gabriel Wilensky. And as a result of a lifelong fascination and years of study into the question of why the Holocaust occurred, Gabriel Wilensky used his technical background as an award-winning veteran of the computer software industry to methodically research and write 6 million crucifixions. The final result is a well-structured and hard-hitting book that presents historical information with polemical conclusions. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gabriel Wilensky.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi Block. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So to get started, I would like you to ask yourselves one question. What would it take to get you to travel to a town in a faraway land, drag all the people out of their homes into a forest nearby, and kill them at point-blank range, one at a time, until all were dead? This is not a rhetorical question. Think about it. What would it take you to do this? What if I told you that people with freckles are guilty of all the problems in the world? Would you go and kill them? What if I told you that people with curly hair or black skin or anything, Italians, Swedes, would you go and kill them? Would you do it if I told you this for 8 years? I think the obvious answer is no. But the Germans did this in the 1930s and 40s. I grappled with this question since I was a teenager. And I thought there had to be something beyond Nazi racial propaganda to explain why people did this sort of thing. It turns out that what Hitler said to his countrymen made sense to them. When I was a little boy, a friend in school told me that the Jews killed Jesus. I had no idea why he said this. I had no even understanding at that age who Jesus was. But he said that all Jews were guilty of doing this. It turns out that the Germans and most of Europeans at the time had heard all their lives that this was the case, that the Jews had killed Jesus. Hitler understood that in order to communicate with the masses, he had to use language that was clear and easy to understand and that they could relate to. something that was familiar to them, something that had religious undertones. When I finally comprehended this, I felt motivated to share this insight with other people who may have been asking themselves the same question. And that's what led me to the motivation to write my book, 6 Million Crucifixions. Maybe you also wondered about this, and I hope that today's talk will help you understand as well. Our story begins shortly after the death of Jesus, when his followers began distancing themselves from mainstream Judaism and Jews. What began as internal intra-Jewish squabbling between different groups within Judaism eventually snowballed and became a much larger fight and eventual hatred. By the time of the Roman War, with the Roman Empire obviously, the animosity between these various different sects was very, very severe. The new sect of early Christians, as they were started to become called, didn't want to be associated with mainstream Judaism. And the reason why they didn't want to be associated with them was because the Jews had been fighting a major war with the Roman Empire, and therefore nobody wanted to be associated with the Jews, who the Romans perceived to be the enemy. And for the Romans, this was a major thing because, keep in mind that the Jews had been fighting a war with the Romans for 4 years, and we're talking about the Roman Empire, the height of their power, 4 years. And therefore, anybody that could look as if they had not been part of that were trying to do that. And so this was one major motivation why the early Christians, the early sect, did everything possible to distance themselves from mainstream Jews and Judaism. They wanted to be perceived as a completely different group of people. The other reason why they did this was because the early Christians wanted to proselytize. They wanted to go outside of the area of Judea, today's Israel, and they wanted to proselytize to the Gentiles over there in areas like Syria, Turkey, Greece, and other parts of the Roman Empire at the time. And in order to convince these Gentiles, which were all pagans, to convert to this new creed, they had to also show them that this new creed had nothing to do with Judaism, which, again, by the Romans was perceived to be the enemy at the time. Most Jews of Galilee, and let alone most of them in the diaspora, had never heard of Jesus, and they didn't recognize him as the Messiah. To his followers, this could only mean that either Jesus was not the Messiah, or the Jews were wrong. How could they possibly not recognize Jesus as the Messiah? Well, they were unable to accept the former. Therefore, they believed that the latter was true, that the Jews were wrong, and not that Jesus was not the Messiah. After this, the early church introduced a new concept called supersessionism, or replacement theology. And in this new theological understanding, the Christianity became the new Israel and God's new favorite, and superseded the old Israel as the chosen of God. This was their perception and their understanding of themselves as a group. They also believed that Christianity replaced Judaism, and Judaism became irrelevant and unnecessary anymore, had lost its place in the world and was no longer God's favorite. God abandoned the chosen people, and the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem was perceived to be an indication of this. They thought that this was a clear sign from God that the Jews were no longer the chosen people. After this, the Christians began calling their books the New Testament. And we all use this term today, but we rarely think, why is the New Testament called the New Testament? And this is another indication of supersessionism, because for the Christians, the new Bible, the Christian Bible, was called the New Testament as in opposition to the Old Testament, the Bible and the Tanakh, which was considered to be old in the sense of superseded, no longer necessary, not old in the sense of ancient. What we see in these images are medieval common allegorical figures, and they replace the replacement of the synagogue by the church. What we see is the church that typically wears a crown carries a cross and a chalice representing the Redeemer's blood. And the superseded synagogue, on the other hand, is always presented with as a blindfolded figure, the blindfold representing spiritual blindness and ignorance, and often its crown is falling off its head. The staff is broken, and the upside-down tablets of the law are falling from her hand. And we see a glass painting on the left, and on the right, these sculptures are from the cathedral in Paris, from Notre Dame. So in Christianity, they introduced the concept of deicide, the killing of God. And deicide is the accusation that Jews killed Jesus. Ultimately, this is an amendment to the real charge leveled against the Jews, namely that they refused to accept the new Christian faith. This, of course, is a slanderous accusation, as it was the Romans who tortured and killed Jesus. And they did this because they perceived him to be a political subversive. However, in Christian writings and art, Jews were typically portrayed as guilty of the scourging and of the crucifixion. In these medieval illustrations, we see Jews, which are recognizable by their Jewish hats, scourging and bringing Jesus to the Roman Pilate, who is also portrayed as a Jew. The accusation of deicide was perhaps the most pernicious teaching about Jews in Christianity and brought untold misery to Jews for almost 2 millennia. During the Nazi era, the anti-Semitic propaganda of the period often used religious terminology and imagery that everyone would understand and relate to. We see here a Nazi propaganda poster from the 1930s accusing the Jews of killing Jesus, of ritual murder, of rejecting him, and being an enemy of Christianity. The Nazi portrayal of Judaism as pernicious to the Christian mind and as bent on destroying Christianity was inherited from hundreds of years of Christian teachings. It's important to point out also that one of the prerequisites for genocide is that the perpetrators feel that they are acting in self-defense against an implacable foe. And Nazis, just like their predecessors in medieval Christian Europe, presented the battle with the Jews as one of self-defense against an all-powerful enemy. By the Middle Ages, the original intra-Jewish sect animosity had become full-blown hatred. Christian thinkers began to produce a new separate theology that defined itself partly as everything Judaism was not. During this time, Jews were accused of all the ills of the world. They were accused of ritually murdering Christian boys to extract their blood to make Passover bread. They were accused of desecrating the host. They were accused of poisoning wells. And when the Black Plague hit Europe in the 14th century and about a third of the population was decimated, Christians everywhere who were already prepared and they already believed that Jews were guilty of poisoning wells and they were bent on destroying Christianity, immediately concluded that the Jews were responsible for the Black Plague. Of course, a preposterous notion given that Jews were dying just as much as anybody else at the time. In these medieval illustrations, we see Christians taking revenge on Jews by burning them alive for allegedly bringing the Black Plague. During Christianity's first 1,000 years, Christians were exposed to intense anti-Semitism in their holy text, the writings of their church fathers, and in clerical sermons. In the Christian Bible, the Jews were presented in the worst possible light. They were presented as bloodthirsty, hateful, and guilty of crucifying Jesus. Jesus and his disciples are presented as different and separate from the Jews, even though both Jesus and his disciples were Jews, just like anybody else, and Jesus didn't really preach any new variation to the mainstream Jewish religion. The Gospels often generally refer to the Jews and not to any specific ones or one. The Gospels establish the association of the Jews with the devil, And keep in mind that just in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles, which are 4 of several and many other books in the New Testament or the Christian Bible, there are about 450 anti-Semitic verses, which amount to an average of 2 per page. Just imagine reading this every week after a few decades. What would you think about Jews? The church fathers, who laid the foundation of Christianity as we know it today, wrote things like, and I quote, "The synagogue is not only a whorehouse and a theater, it is also a den of thieves and a haunt of wild animals. No better disposed than pigs or goats, the Jews live by the rules of debauchery and inordinate gluttony. Only one thing they understand, to gorge themselves and get drunk." This was said by somebody the Catholic Church later called a saint, Saint John Chrysostom, who happened to be the Bishop of Antioch in the year 386 of the Common Era. I'm going to read you another passage from a different person. "The Jews are the most worthless of all men. They are lecherous, greedy, rapacious. They are perfidious murderers of Christ. They worship the devil. Their religion is a sickness. The Jews are the odious assassins of Christ, and for killing God, there is no expiation possible, no indulgence or pardon. Christians may never cease vengeance, and the Jew must live in servitude forever. God always hated the Jews. It is essential that all Christians hate them." This was said by another bishop, this time the Bishop of Milan, Saint Ambrose, in the year 374 of the Common Era. This was a sermon said in a church. In the year 1095, gangs of people led by adventurers, ex-priests, and inferior monks went on a first of several crusades to liberate the Holy Land from the Saracens. The cross on which Jesus died provide the name and ideology for the events. Thinking of the crucifixion led Christians to seek vengeance from those who believed to be responsible for it. The Crusaders declared in clear anti-Jewish theology, and I quote, "You are the children of those who killed our object of veneration, hanging him from a tree, and he himself said, 'There will yet come a day when my children will come and avenge my blood.' We are his children, and it is therefore obligatory for us to avenge him, since you are the ones who rebel and disbelieve him." Godfrey of Bouillon, who led the first crusade, swore to, and I quote, "avenge the blood of Christ on Israel and to leave no single member of the Jewish race alive." As the mob fell upon the Jews of Rouen, Metz, and then the Rhineland, with the war cry, "Baptism or death," they murdered tens of thousands of Jews, even eliminating entire communities. As the first Crusader stampede trampled upon Jews in the 11th century, they did so on what they imagined Jews to be, and not on what they actually were. And this is an important point, because the imaginary picture of Jews was the result of the portrayal of Jews as still murdering Jesus in Jerusalem in the permanent present tense of the liturgy, repeated year after year. So for them, the death of Jesus was not an event in the past. It was something that was kept alive every time that they read about this in the New Testament. And therefore, because in the New Testament the Jews are accused en masse, every Jew is guilty of the death of Jesus according to the New Testament, and not only the Jews of the time of Jesus, but the Jews of all time. Therefore, for Christians in medieval Europe, the Jews that lived next to them, their neighbors, were equally as guilty as the people who actually crucified Jesus, which happened to be the Romans, not the Jews, but they believed to be the Jews. Well, we see this illustration from the 13th century. It's from a French Bible, and we see Crusaders killing Jews. And again, you can identify them because they have their conical hats, which they were forced to wear at the time. The Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215 decreed that the Jews were to live in confined quarters and wear distinctive clothing. By 1555, Pope Paul IV articulated these and other restrictions and enforced them forcefully. Never before had such language been officially promulgated by a pope. He decreed that a walled quarter, which is to say a ghetto, had to be erected in every city in which the Jews were to live, segregated from the Christian community. Again, this is 1555, about 400 years before the Nazis. Jews were to have just one synagogue, and they were banned from constructing others, and any ones that were already built were supposed to be demolished. Jews could not own any buildings, and they were forced to sell to Christians any properties that they may have already owned. Jews were prohibited from having nurses, housekeepers, or other Christian servants. Jews were prohibited from playing, eating, or fraternizing with other Christians. Jews were not allowed to be addressed as superiors, even by poorer Christians. Jews were not allowed to rent houses or businesses outside of the ghetto, unless they had special permission from the cardinal vicar. Jews could not acquire real estate outside of the ghetto. Jews could not pursue higher education. They could not hold office. They were prevented from being lawyers, druggists, painters, and architects. Physicians among them were prohibited from attending or taking care of Christians. The latter would continue until the 17th century, when the clergy of Württemberg in Germany would still say, and I quote, "It is better to die with Christ than to be cured by a Jew doctor aided by the devil." And they did many times, because it happened to be that Jews were the best doctors in Europe at the time, and those Christians that refused to be treated by them actually died, usually of horrible diseases. This anti-Jewish papal bull is very important, because both the language and the content are almost a literal antecedent to the anti-Jewish legislation that the Germans, the Italians, French, Hungarians, and others passed in the 1940s, 30s and 40s. The 1860 photograph that we see on the left shows a typical narrow street in the confined, dark, squalid ghetto in Rome, literally across the river Tiber from the Vatican. The Roman ghetto was largely demolished and the Jews freed after the Italian secular forces took over from the Vatican in 1870. 1870. We're not talking about ancient history here. A lot of the grandparents that were the murderers and perpetrators of the Second World War were alive at the time. If not grandparents, certainly great-grandparents. The photo on the right shows one of the currently walled-up gates to the ghetto in Rome. Of course, the Nazis, who were as eager to eliminate the Jews from their midst as their Christian predecessors, also established ghettos in most major cities where hundreds of thousands of Jews were imprisoned and confined, and where many would die of starvation and illness. As Cardinal Edward Cassidy, an American cardinal, said many years after the war, and I quote, "The ghetto, which came into existence in 1955 with a papal bull, became in Nazi Germany the antechamber of the extermination." These are pictures of the Warsaw and Lodz ghettos in Poland. The sign at the entrance of the ghetto reads, "Jewish residential area, entrance forbidden." During the Middle Ages, various Christian Catholic councils and popes decreed that the Jews were an evil influence on Christians, and thus Christians needed to avoid them. The church then established ghettos, and the Jews were segregated. They also mandated that the Jews wear special clothing to distinguish themselves from the Christians. Jewish women were forced to wear a yellow shawl, and men a yellow conical hat or a yellow badge on their chest. The conical hat was meant to resemble a horn, to further strengthen the association of the Jew with the devil. By the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, they found that they had little left to invent in their campaign against the Jews. The German anti-Jewish laws, the ghettos, the imposition of distinguishing marks in their clothing had all been previously established by the church. We see on the left a Nazi propaganda poster depicting a stereotypical Jew wearing the yellow Star of David. The text reads, "He is guilty for the war." In 1144 in Norwich, in England, a new and notorious allegation was concocted accusing Jews of ritually murdering Christian boys to obtain blood to make Passover bread. This blood libel spread like wildfire and led to multiple instances of persecution and torture of Jews every time a Christian boy disappeared or his body was found. This accusation was related to the alleged murder lust of the Jews and their bloodthirstiness, based on the conception that Jews hated Christianity and humankind in general. This medieval illustration depicts a cabal of Jewish men extracting the blood of Christian boys. What we see here are two examples of ritual murder accusation as reported by the anti-Semitic publication Der Stürmer during the Nazi period. On the left, we see the May 1939 edition with the headline Ritual Murder, showing a reprint of the same medieval depiction of a purported ritual murder committed by Jews. The May 1934 edition on the right, with the headline Jewish Murder Plan Against Gentile Humanity Revealed, shows a contemporary rendition of the same thing. Adolf Hitler was born and raised a Catholic. As a young man, he wanted to become an abbot, although later in his life he did not believe in God. As he was never excommunicated, he officially died as a Catholic as well. In May 1945, after having learned of Hitler's death, Cardinal Bertram of Breslau ordered that, and I quote, a solemn requiem mass be held in commemoration of the Führer, so that the Almighty Son, Hitler, be admitted to paradise. By the time Hitler began his political career, he realized the importance of projecting an image of religiosity. In his public speeches, he made a point to establish a providential connection between him, his work, and God, as well as remark on the religious support for his fight against the Jews. Again, this was part of the same plan that he had all along, where he understood that in order to communicate to the masses properly, he had to use language that they could relate to and understand, and using religious imagery was part of this. Everybody had heard this from their priests before, so when Hitler said it, it resonated with them. On the Nazi propaganda poster on the left, we see Hitler in religious imagery ordinary Germans could relate to and understand, mirroring the dove that descended on Jesus when John the Baptist baptized him. What appears to be an eagle hovers against the light of heaven over a messianic Hitler. On the right, we see Hitler praying at the end of a rally in Vienna, political rally in Vienna. The understanding that Hitler was on a divine mission was generalized. Hermann Göring, Hitler's second in command, said in distinctly Christian terms, and I quote, God gave the Savior to the German people. We have faith, deep and unshakable faith, that he, Hitler, was sent to us by God to save Germany. You may or may not know this, but in Christianity the term save and savior and saving is very important. And therefore these terms are very loaded and very important to a Christian audience. And the Protestant German Christians expressed, and I quote, in the person of the Führer we behold the one sent from God, who places Germany in the presence of the Lord of history. Hitler understood that to conquer the German masses, he would have to appear not only religious, but also friendly to the churches. He often praised them in public, appeared in or around churches. Hitler was well aware of the church's long anti-Semitic record. In a meeting with Bishop Berning and Monsignor Steinmann in April 1933, he complained, and I quote, I have been attacked because of my handling of the Jewish question. The Catholic Church considered the Jews pestilent for 1,500 years, put them into ghettos, etc., because they recognized the Jews for what they were. In the epoch of liberalism, the danger was no longer recognized. I am moving back toward a time in which the 1,500-year-old tradition was implemented. I do not set race over religion, but I recognize the representative of this race as pestilent for the state and for the church, and perhaps I am thereby doing Christianity a great service for pushing them out of schools and public functions. The Catholic Church has expressed in modern times that Nazism was a neo-pagan movement and claimed that Nazi anti-Semitism had its roots outside of Christianity. This is not so. Even though Nazism may have been a neo-pagan movement, the vast majority of its followers remained faithful and believing Christians. Christian anti-Judaism is the foundation on which Nazi anti-Semitism was built. Despite the Catholic Church's official line, the roots of Nazi anti-Semitism are indisputably inside Christianity. Under the Weimar Republic, Catholic organizations of every kind multiplied. New monasteries were built, new religious orders were founded, and new schools were established. As the historian Karl Bachem said in 1931, and I quote, "Never yet has a Catholic country possessed such a developed system of all conceivable Catholic associations as today's Catholic Germany." This was just 2 years before the Nazis were elected to power. Despite neo-pagan claims and Nazi efforts to eliminate Christianity from Germany, as late as 1944, 1 year before the conclusion of the war, only 3.5% of the population described themselves as neo-pagan. Despite all pressures to leave the church, even among the SS, almost a fourth remained in the Catholic faith. By 1940, over 95% of the German population were still tax-paying members of their respective Protestant or Catholic churches. Religiosity and Christianity were very much a part of the Christian worldview. And this is also true, by the way, of the various different countries that they invaded where Jews were persecuted. France and, of course, East Europe, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and so on. In these photographs, we see Nazi brown shirts attending church. And this was a very common sight during the 1930s. Indisputably, Christianity was, before and during the war, the powerful common denominator that permeated German society at all levels, and the indelible identity that anchored the ordinary German. On the left, we see our roadside cross, commonly found everywhere along roads in 1930s Germany. The accusation of deicide was fully incorporated in the Christian psyche by the time of the Nazis. The illustration on the right is from the anti-Semitic German book, children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom, as this German mother explains to her children in the caption, "When you see a cross, then think of the horrible murder by the Jews on Golgotha." Even though the Vatican objected to certain aspects of Nazism and considered it a heresy, the German Catholic Church and the various German Protestant churches wholeheartedly embraced it. Until Hitler took power in 1933, the Catholic Church banned the faithful from becoming members of the Nazi Party. Shortly after, the Vatican signed a concordat, an agreement with the Nazi regime. After that, the German Catholic Church lifted the ban, and millions of German Catholics joined the party in droves. This was a tsunami that basically was created by this, and we know the rest. Not even after it was clear what the Nazis were all about and they stood for, did the church admonish the faithful to leave the party or refrain from following its immoral orders. Throughout the Nazi period, clerics from both the Catholic and Protestant churches showed support for Hitler and Nazi policies. They did this in a number of different ways. They regularly appeared with Nazis. They regularly admonished the faithful to obey Hitler. They regularly praised Hitler and his policies. They regularly supported the persecution of the Jews. They provided material assistance in the hunt for Jews by providing the government with baptismal records, which allowed them to identify who was a Jew. They didn't have to do this. They were very glad to do this, though. Archbishop Gruber declared, this was in the 30s, declared to an enthusiastic audience that he gave, and I quote, his complete and wholehearted support to the new government and the new Reich. Bishop Berning declared that German bishops not only accepted and recognized the new state, but served it, and I quote, with ardent love and with all our strength. Cardinal Bertram addressed German Catholics in his Diocese of Breslau in 1938, 3 years after the Nuremberg racial anti-Jewish laws had been passed, and he invoked scriptures to support the Nazi regime. Quote, "There is no need to urge you to give respect and obedience to the new authorities of the German state. You all know the words of the apostle. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities." Bishop Vornewasser of Trier exhibited the seamless robe as an exceptional show of support. The tunic had not been exhibited to the faithful since 1891. He declared to a congregation of Catholic youth in Trier Cathedral that with raised heads and firm step we have entered the new Reich and we are prepared to serve it with all the might of our body and soul. Bishop Dibelius, this time a Protestant bishop, declared in a letter written in April 1933 that he had always been an anti-Semite. One cannot fail to appreciate that in all the corrosive manifestations of modern civilization, Jewry plays a leading role. Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, from the Confessing Church, also displayed theological anti-Judaism, and I quote, "The state's measures against the Jewish people are connected in a very special way with the Church," he declared. "In the Church of Christ, we have never lost sight of the idea that the chosen people who nailed the Savior of the world to the cross must bear the curse of the action through a long history of suffering." Medieval Christian thinkers began asking themselves, what kind of rational creature would deliberately reject the truth and kill God? It was a legitimate question. What they concluded was that only someone who was an irrational and inhuman agent of Satan could act that way. As preposterous as this may sound to us today, in the medieval Christian mind, Jews were literally conceived of as inhuman demonic creatures that use Satan's weapons to fight the forces of truth and salvation. Christians familiar with biblical imagery, for example from John chapter 8, the Gospel of John chapter 8, where Jesus tells the Jews, and I quote, "You belong to your father, the devil," had no difficulty in accepting this. The conviction that the Jews worked together with the devil explains how it was possible to accept a priori every accusation against Jews, regardless of how preposterous it was. On the left illustration, we see a detail from a 1475 German anti-Semitic painting portraying the devil, complete with hoofs, tail, horns, and wearing a Jewish badge. That's that little round circle, which is the predecessor of the Jewish Star of David during the Nazi period. On the right is the February 1943 edition of the anti-Semitic publication Der Stürmer. The caption to the photograph of the stereotypical Eastern European Jew reads, "Satan." At the bottom of the page is the ubiquitous Nazi slogan, "The Jews are our misfortune," echoing Martin Luther's writings, and I quote, "The Jews are for us a heavy burden, the calamity of our being. They are like a plague, pestilence, pure misfortune in our country." As you may know, most of Germans were Protestants, Lutherans, and they were big admirers, especially in the Nazi Party, big admirers of Martin Luther, whose anti-Semitic vitriolic writings are pretty disgusting. The association of Jews with the devil, which had been pervasive in Christendom for centuries, found expression in many outlets during the Nazi period. The Nazi propaganda machine spoke to the German people in familiar language they understood and that they easily related to. Otto Ollendorf, the commander of a mobile killing squad that slaughtered 90,000 Jews in the Soviet Union, wrote to his wife after the war, and I quote, "Jewry has continued to sow hate, and it reaps hate again. How else could one see it as anything but the work of demons who waged their battle against us. The photograph on the left is from a roadside warning sign found in Germany during the Third Reich. It reads, "Jews in the Blossersberg community are not welcome. To know the Jew is to know the devil." The photograph in the center shows a sign in the countryside in Eschenbach in Franconia in July 1935, and it reads, "The father of the Jews is the devil." In smaller type below it, you can read Jesus Christ. Now think about this. What were those peasant children supposed to think, and what they were supposed to feel? With this kind of indoctrination, can we really blame them for killing Jews a few years later in their lives? I mean, these kids in this photograph are probably 12 or something like this, and this is in the early 30s. So these kids actually were in the German armed forces or the SS during the war. The photograph on the right shows an anti-Jewish sign posted on a street in Dresden. It reads, "The Jews are the children of the devil." Below the sign, the large sign, are two smaller ones that read, "The Jews are our misfortune." Anti-Semitism in Germany was also directed specifically to children. Like the propaganda aimed at adults, the use of language with a religious tenor in magazines, billboards, and books was critical to clearly impress the tender reader's mind. For example, the notorious anti-Semite Julius Streicher said in a speech, "Without a solution to the Jewish question, there will be no salvation for mankind." Again, the term salvation. He didn't say, "We will not solve the world problems. We will not solve the war," or whatever. He talked about salvation. Both of the illustrations we see here are from the children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom. The one on the left shows a billboard announcing a talk by Streicher. It tells the German children that the Jews are our misfortune, and that those who are fighting against the Jews are struggling with the devil. At a real-life Nuremberg gathering during Christmas of 1936, Streicher addressed 2,000 children, and I quote, "Do you know who the devil is?" he asked his breathlessly listening audience. "The Jew, the Jew," replied 2,000 children's voices. Another story in The Poisonous Mushroom tells of a German girl who is waiting to be examined by a Jewish doctor, and quote, "Her eyes stare into the face of the Jewish doctor, and his face is the face of the devil. In the middle of this devil's face is a huge crooked nose. Behind the spectacles, two criminal eyes, and the thick lips are grinning, a grinning that expresses, 'Now I've got you at last, you little German girl.'" The children learning these things in the 1930s were the young soldiers, SS, policemen, and local auxiliaries who willingly and eagerly denounced, hunted down, tortured, and murdered Jews in the 1940s. How else could they have acted? Who would not eagerly kill the devil? The Holocaust forces us to seek answers to tough questions. What motivated the perpetrators to act so willingly to round up, deport, and slaughter thousands of people in the most hellish ways? Why was it that they did not excuse themselves from this task when their commanders gave them the choice and when there was no consequence to do so? Why was it that they willingly took pictures of themselves and their victims to share with their friends and families back home? The picture on the right is an example of this. These are not the actions of reluctant functionaries, blindly obeying orders. Their willingness, and in most cases eagerness, to exterminate Jews, and to do so in the ways they did, was predicated on the basis of a profound, visceral hatred towards Jews, instilled in them almost from the moment that they could understand language. A hatred that went much deeper than the racial propaganda of the day. The Germans and their helpers went far beyond because they felt that the Jews were guilty of monstrous crimes and that they were dangerous. They exterminated Jews because they felt that they were defending themselves from what they perceived to be a demonic influence in their Christian way of life. The perpetrators inflicted unspeakable pain and suffering on their victims and then killed them because, aside from the racial hatred that made them think that they were eliminating a subhuman species, they were taking revenge for allegedly causing capitalism, for communism, for revolution, for the defeat in World War I, for unemployment, for economic depression, for taking the best jobs, and a number of other baseless accusations, all successors in modern guise and language to the accusations of ritual murder, causing the Black Plague, associating with the devil, poisoning wells, desecrating the host, rejecting Christian revelation, defiling Christian minds, and of killing Christ. Did the priests assigned to the German armed forces admonish the faithful to refrain from murdering Jews, as that was a crime and a mortal sin? No. Instead, they provided group absolution and succor to soldiers. Catholic military Bishop Rakowski was the spiritual leader of the priests assigned to the German armed forces. Did he instruct his priests to admonish the faithful to refrain from murdering Jews, as that was a crime and a mortal sin? No. Instead, he blamed the Jews for the war and all of Germany's misfortunes and instructed the priests to admonish the flock to blindly follow orders, reminding them that, and I quote, "Behind all this stands God himself with all his will and command," and telling them that they should obey the Führer out of holiest conviction of conscience. Sometimes the sermons from regular priests were quite explicit. On a Sunday sermon in May 1942 in Kowal in Poland, the priest gave clear guidance to his flock, and I quote, "No trace of a Jew is to remain. We should erase them from the face of the earth." 1942 Poland, a sermon in a church. As is to be expected, this led the perpetrators of the Holocaust to think that they were doing the right thing and that it was God's will. Not very surprising. As a daily and constant reminder, their belt buckles had the inscription, "God with us," stamped on it. We can see this on the upper left image. The photograph on the lower left shows a religious service for German soldiers. This was a very common sight on the Eastern Front. All the soldiers had priests assigned to their various different groups, and they had these services often. The photographs on the right show the military chaplains assigned to the special units who went behind the army on the Eastern Front and whose responsibility was to round up and shoot all the Jews in every town along the front, the Einsatzgruppen and the Ordnungspolizei, the order police. The men we saw murdering the mother and child and the naked women in a ravine in the previous page came from units just like this ones. The upper right photograph shows the machine gun used by the unit to murder Jews lined up on the edge of mass graves. And the person standing, it's not very clear there because the photograph is not of very good quality, but the person standing is the chaplain. You can see a cross hanging from his neck. The lower right photo shows the military chaplain before or after the religious service cleansing the souls of these men. The Nuremberg trial set the legal precedent of accusing someone of incitement and of using hateful speech. But if Julius Streicher, the publisher of the Stürmer, was accused of leading the education of the German people in perverse ways, of concentrating on the youth and childhood of Germany, of injecting the poison of hate in the minds of millions of Germans, so could the Church. However, in this picture of the trial of major war criminals in Nuremberg, emblematic of justice, we do not see any cleric who may have been guilty of committing crimes before, during, or after the war. Had it not been for the Stürmer and its publisher, German fascism would not have been able to educate in such a short period of time those mass murderers who put into effect the criminal plans of Hitler and his thugs by murdering almost 6 million Jews. And had it not been for Christianity's teachings about Jews, there would not have been a Sturmer, a Streicher, or a Hitler. Bishop Angelo Roncalli, who had fought tirelessly to save Jews during the war, became Pope John the 23rd after the wartime Pope. Pius XII died in 1958. John 23rd removed the term perfidious Jews from the Good Friday prayer and subsequently renounced all negative references to Jews, such as allusions to their veiled hearts and blindness. In 1962, almost 20 years after the Holocaust, he convened the Second Vatican Council. The result was the Nostra Aetate Declaration, which stated that the crucifixion, and I quote, cannot be blamed upon all the Jews then living without distinction, nor upon the Jews of today. In addition to this, the fathers declared that Jews are not, quote, repudiated or cursed by God, which of course was a very common belief before then. These statements mark the beginning of the end of over 1,600 years of Christian anti-Semitism. The Catholic Church, followed shortly afterwards by the Protestant churches, issued instruction to priests on how to teach and discuss Judaism to the faithful. In 1998, after 11 years in the making and more than half a century after the Holocaust, the Vatican, under Pope John Paul II, issued the statement, "We Remember," a reflection on the Shoah. This was a well-intentioned document, but it fell short of being absolutely truthful. Moreover, the document was simply too little too late. It was mostly a defensive apologetic attempt to exonerate the Church. In contrast, the American Catholic bishops were more forthright. And I quote, "Christian anti-Judaism did lay the groundwork for racial genocidal anti-Semitism by stigmatizing not only Judaism but Jews themselves for opprobrium and contempt. So did the Nazi theories tragically found fertile soil in which to plant the horror of an unprecedented attempt at genocide. We Remember's call for the Church's ongoing repentance for these sins against Jews will involve for most Christians an assumption of responsibility for our collective Christian past." So what can we conclude of all this? The reason the peoples of Europe developed the ideas of modern anti-Semitism, succeeded in disseminating them so quickly, and felt no compunction in collaborating in the execution of the final solution of the Jewish question, is because as the inheritors of a legacy of 16 centuries of Christian conditioning of hostility toward Jews, they believed there was indeed a Jewish question that had to be resolved. The Christian population was predisposed to absorb any new idea that conformed to a worldview in which Jews were malevolent, hateful, and perceived to be dangerous, and which provided them with a way to eliminate the perceived danger and problem. Even though other elements contributed to the fantastic notions that the Germans and others held about Jews, the Church's anti-Semitism was a necessary, although not sufficient, cause of the extermination of the Jews during the Second World War. As Roberto Farinacci, a member of Mussolini's fascist Grand Council, said, and I quote, "It comforts our souls to know that if as Catholics we became anti-Semites, we owe it to the teachings that the Church has promulgated over the past 20 centuries." Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. If you'd like to ask them, go ahead. Yes?
Gabriel, do you see an analogy between the past and what is happening within the Islamic community where you hear the imams using much of the same dialogue
Yes.
against Israel and the Jews today?
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned that because in the Islamic world is very encapsulated and very close to outside influence. However, in this one instance, they were very open to embrace the terminology and imagery of Christian anti-Semitism from the past, and they absorbed it and expanded on it wholeheartedly. In today's Muslim world, anti-Semitism is a very prevalent and officially sanctioned thing. And it uses the terminology and imagery from anti-Semitism in the past. In Egypt recently, they had a 40 segment piece on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. They had like a soap opera or something that they made out of it, and people watch this thing and believe it. Yes?
You said that the Catholic priests, like, what do you call it? Like, want Hitler to stay, and liked Hitler, but I may be wrong, but didn't Hitler, like, say that there was no religion of the Nazis? Like, there's no religion group of the Nazis?
It's an excellent question. The Nazis were, officially, they were not, the hierarchy of the Nazi party were not believers in God, but they were all somewhat religious, and to some degrees, some of them believed in God, some others did not. From a party perspective, the Nazis created a version of the Protestant church called the German Catholics, the German Christians. And they had their own religion, which was sanctioned by the Nazi party, and it modified the Protestant view of Christianity so that they expunged, they removed all the Jewish origins of Christianity, which of course Christianity is based on Judaism. So they removed all this. They claimed that Jesus was an Aryan and was like a Viking that somehow magically showed up in Judea at the time. And so they basically Aryanized Christianity. So from an official point of view, this is what they believed. They did not promote it aggressively, though. And ultimately, Hitler, if he had won the war and had basically got his way, I think that they would have destroyed the church. Yes?
Can you see even a greater influence of the church, not just in Germany, but in Eastern Europe, where a lot of the local population took it upon themselves to kill the Jews?
Absolutely. The Eastern European peoples were very religious people, and they were not nearly as educated as the Germans were. Even though the German armed forces and the SS had a cross-section of the population, of the German population, which meant that they had anything from mechanics to PhD doctorate people. But for the most part, the German people were very educated. And the Eastern European peoples were not nearly as educated, which meant that they got most of the information that they had, most of the education that they had was from the church. They received it from their pastors and their priests. And therefore, whatever they knew about Jews, they did not know from listening to Goebbels' radio broadcasts, but rather they knew it from what they heard from the priest in Sunday sermons. So when they acted upon the Jews during the Second World War, they did it because of these reasons, because they had internalized the teachings of Christianity against Jews and acted that way because of that. Yes?
I think we should remember that. I want to make one point, but I think we should remember that every Nazi was obviously born in a Christian home.
Yes.
The second point is how quickly things changed. The foreign minister of Germany prior to 1933 was a Jew by the name of Walter Rathenau, who they killed as soon as they took power. Now here you may be able to help me. The prime minister or the premier of France was Leon Blum, who was another Jew. And this was prior to where both groups, the French and the Germans, took away to ground up the Jews. The French did it too without any real force. Vichy France and the other part of France cooperated. So things always appear. I mean, we've never had a president in the United States who was a Jew, and France did. We had Kissinger as foreign minister who was supposedly a Jew, and they had surface may seem like they progressed, but in reality, Jew hatred is endemic and can change in a minute. And I feel that, you know, sure, the Muslims are very anti-Semitic, but I think there'd be very little opposition to what they do. That's why most of the people in Europe who've actually become more anti-Semitic.
Yes. Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, keep in mind that in France that has a long history of anti-Semitism. And yeah, it's true that Blum was a Jew, and it's true that he was in government. But in France, the Jewish community was very cultured and very well positioned to do this. And in a way, the French, the French after the Dreyfus affair, may have been willing to ameliorate the pain, if you will, by electing to power somebody of the Jewish faith. In Germany, they did not have something like the Dreyfus affair, but they had a long history of animosity and persecution of Jews. However, when Rathenau came to power, it was before the Nazis, of course, came to power, and therefore it was just the common anti-Semitic worldview that the Germans had that pervaded the German society at the time, and it was not a state-sponsored persecution. Rathenau would never have been able to come to power when the Nazis were in power, but he was able to do it before because there was no state-sponsored persecution at the time. Yes, yes,
And Churchill, in his series *The Gathering Storm*,
yes.
often questioned and tried to find out the peculiarity. Why did Hitler hate the Jews? I mean, and you know, in one way, I can understand a mechanism for just, you know, fostering the hatred as a part of a bigger picture. But was there something deeper, or something that's now more revealed as to what Hitler's particular hatred was?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's in human nature to believe that you know, there's always the notion of the other, and you know, we gather in groups, and we gather in tribes, and we gather in nations, and there's always the need. It seems like there's an inherent human need to find the other, and the Jews and the Gypsies and some other groups in Europe happen to be what the Germans and the English and others perceive to be an alien group within them. This is especially true of Eastern Europe, where the Jews did not assimilate very much at all, and they dressed differently, and they wore long beards, and they wore different clothes, and they spoke different language, and they didn't really interact with the general population nearly as much as in Western Europe. So the peoples of Europe, for the longest time, because of religious indoctrination, always felt that the Jews were different and separate, and they did not give them the same rights as everybody else. You know, Jews, until the emancipation in the 18th century in Europe, did not actually have any legal rights, pretty much. They were not citizens of those countries, and they were always thought of as the other, the ontological other.
But did Hitler ride a wave, or was he just responding to a political norm, or was he trying to use that, or did he have some other deep-seated?
No, he was of course riding the. He was part of the same thing. I mean, Hitler, just like everybody else there, absorbed all this stuff, like everybody else. And again, you know, as I was saying at the very beginning, if Hitler had said to the people that the people with freckles are guilty of all the crimes in the world and guilty of bringing the world economy down and everything, people would have laughed at him. The reason why people didn't laugh at him when he said that the Jews were guilty of all this stuff was because people already believed all this, just like Hitler had believed it before. He didn't say anything new to them. The one thing that was relatively new, it was not completely new, but it was relatively new, was the racial aspect. And you know, from the late 19th century all the way to Hitler in the 1930s, anti-Semitism has shifted from a theological point of view, which is a lot of what we cover today, to this pseudo-scientific racial aspect, you know, the Jews being perceived as subhuman Untermenschen. But of course, this was just it was basically the consequence of the Enlightenment when Europe began shifting away from the grips of the church and began shifting away from the theological notions that they had understood before, and they started to look for things that sounded rational and sounded scientific. And the Enlightenment basically brought new lexicon, and Jews were perceived to be the other But now, because they had something supposedly inherent to their biology that made them different, and not because theologically they had rejected Jesus or all the other stuff that they had believed in the past. So Hitler definitely was riding the wave, unquestionably. Yeah. Yes.
I have a comment, if I may.
Yes, of course.
First of all, I love the name of your book.
Thank you.
The other comment I have is that this is the first lecture that I've ever been to that addressed the Holocaust, but also took into account the role that the church has played.
Mhm.
And I think you're very heroic
Thank you.
for presenting this.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I'm just wondering, I'm thinking to myself, it hasn't disappeared. The anti-Semitism that has been built up over the centuries didn't suddenly go away just because the Second Vatican Council or something like that.
Yeah.
What do we do now?
Well, it kind of went underground for a while, and it's now resurfacing. It went underground because the church, I don't have that many great things to say about the church, but I have to commend them for the work that they've done after the Second Vatican Council. They did do good work to try to ameliorate the problems that they had themselves created. And they did teach the priests how to teach about Jews. And they in Catholicism and other religious education, they actually taught good things about Jews. And relationship between Christians and Jews are now better than they ever been. And so actually the work of the Second Vatican Council and subsequent papers and documents that they did were very helpful, and they are very, very positive. However, you're right that anti-Semitism as a scourge has not disappeared, and a big part of the reason why it has not disappeared is because even though the church has been teaching all this stuff for many years now, since 1965 until now, many people continue to teach. They don't go to church, they don't listen to these sermons now, and they continue to teach their children what their parents taught them. So to some extent in the Christian population, this undertone of anti-Jewish animosity still exists. But today, the biggest problem that we have in terms of anti-Semitism doesn't come from Christianity, it comes from the Muslim world. Yes.
In continuing what she was saying, I think we have to differentiate between Vatican and Protestantism.
Yes.
Because the Protestants are still very anti-Semitic, and they are not bound by Vatican II, even though Catholicism has changed greatly. But question to you, in the never again statement that we always say, during the Holocaust they also aligned with Islam, Nazism, and do you see that happening again as Islam rises in the United States? We have this whole Protestant population that absolutely hates Jews.
Well, I somewhat agree and somewhat disagree with what you were saying about the Protestant church. The Protestant church, it's true, they are not bound by what the Catholic Church does, but the Protestant church follows suit right after the Catholic Church, after the Second Vatican Council, and they did similar things. To a lesser degree, because you have to understand that the Protestant church is not a church, it's rather a collection of churches. And I think there's over 1,000 Protestant denominations, and there is no central organization like the Vatican that controls them, so it's harder for them to organize this way. However, they have done, I think, a fairly decent job in trying to ameliorate the problem, and they have done similar things to the Catholic Church in terms of education. It's true that many Protestants are still anti-Semites, but it's also true that many Protestants, most notably the fundamentalist Protestants in the American South, are very, very pro-Jewish. And they are very staunch supporters of Israel and of the Jewish people. And they love Jews, and they believe that their ancestry definitely comes from there. They understand it and they embrace it. In terms of the second point that you were making, it's true that Islam had a connection to Nazi Germany. Amin al-Husseini, who was the Mufti of Jerusalem during the Second World War, was a big anti-Semite, and he, of course, was fighting the Jews who were immigrating into Israel at the time. And he was in Germany for most of the war. He actually was received by Himmler, Goebbels, and Hitler, and he loved them. And he, as a matter of fact, was going to work with the Germans to bring the final solution to Israel, to Palestine at the time. And he was working very closely with the Nazis for this. And he actually helped materially the Nazis by putting together Muslim divisions in Yugoslavia to fight for the Nazi cause. Sorry, go ahead.
Your thesis is so incredible because it explains so many things, because everything that happened was so irrational,
Yeah.
especially considering that in Germany, I believe the Jews were like less than 1% of
This is
the
true.
population.
Yes.
And those German Jews loved Germany
Yes.
and felt more German than Jewish.
Yeah.
They adored their German heritage.
Yes.
So for everything to have started there, it had to be everything completely irrational, including differentiating between Jewish Semites and Muslim Semites.
Yes.
You know, it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, the whole
And today, it's also, you know, you pretend not to be an anti-Semite just by being an anti-Israel, you know.
Yes, correct. So yes, it's true. I mean, Germany had, I believe it was a little less than 500,000 Jews at the time of the Nazi takeover of power. So there was less than 1% of the population, which meant that most Germans had never even encountered a Jew. Literally, they never saw one. And even if they had seen one, as you were correctly stating, German Jews were completely assimilated. They didn't dress differently, they didn't speak differently, they were completely assimilated into German society. And therefore, there was no way of telling who was a Jew and who wasn't. It was not like in East Europe, which was very different. So that is completely true, yes. And it was irrational. And the notion of Semites and anti-Semites and the whole racial theory that the Nazis espoused is completely irrational and stupid. It makes absolutely no scientific sense of any kind. You know. Yes.
In light of the collaboration of the Catholic Church with the pogroms, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the Church should be more outspoken with regard to the anti-Semitism in the Islamic world, being more assertive than they are today, because they seem to be very passive, particularly Pope Benedict seems
Yes.
to be attempting to be on all sides
Yes.
without taking into account what the Church has done in the past.
I think so. I think that the Church should definitely be doing a much stronger case against anti-Semitism today. They should be making very loud case against it, particularly in light of everything that we saw today. They should be, the Pope and everybody else should be making very loud pronouncements against what's happening on the Muslim world. And you're right, Pope Benedict, as opposed to his predecessor, Pope John Paul II, is definitely very meek, if you will, or lukewarm towards this problem. And he's trying to cater to all parties, and he's trying to be nice to everyone. But that's not the right way of operating, because if you're trying to be right to everyone, you may not be doing the right thing. And when it comes to what's happening in the Muslim world, anti-Semitism there is very reminiscent of anti-Semitism in 1930s Germany. So in fact, it's the only time in history after the Nazi period when anti-Semitism is openly sponsored by the states and openly discussed, and it's openly accepted by the society. And the fact that the Catholic Church is not making a huge pronouncement about it is problematic, to put it mildly, yes.
Gabriel, do you think that's because this Pope was in the Nazi youth movement?
I don't think so. I know a lot of people actually believe that.
Really?
Um,
Really?
I doubt it.
But it's true.
The Pope, this existing Pope was actually in the Nazi youth movement. He wasn't.
The question was if Pope Benedict is acting this way because he was in the Hitlerjugend, in the Hitler Youth. And my opinion is that probably not. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, this was when he was a teenager. It probably influenced his view of Jews and Judaism as it did to everyone else in Germany at the time. However, this was a long time ago, and he went through the entire process after Vatican II that all the Catholic priests went to. So I think that his attitude vis-a-vis Israel and the Jews today is not necessarily informed by his learnings during the Hitler Youth period, although I do agree that it must have influenced him at the time in some way. Impossible to tell to what extent. But it's a good point. Yes?
Years ago, I had a friend who was a minister, and he indicated that at a conference that is at in Washington, D.C., with another group of
Yeah. I think that's probably true, but keep in mind that what happened in the 1930s in Germany was an incredible phenomenon, and the reason why Hitler managed to do what he did is extraordinary. But the reason is, we have to understand that even though not everybody in Germany was a Nazi during that period, most people were at least happy to see the resurgence of Germany. Keep in mind that the recent history of the German people was the loss of World War I, which was a catastrophic event for them. It was a major loss of not only a war, but material and human loss. And therefore, they were humiliated after the Versailles Treaty. So they were happy to see the resurgence of Germany after Hitler took power. They were not necessarily supporters of Hitler's platform, political platform. They didn't necessarily perhaps agree, some of them didn't perhaps agree with his racial policies or his other policies, but they liked the fact that now Germany was alive again. Germany was bankrupt pretty much. They had hyperinflation. It cost like 10 billion Deutschmarks or something to buy a gallon of milk. So when Hitler came to power, they were happy to see what was going on. Hitler got the economy going again at the expense of the Jews, of course, but they didn't care because Germany was actually a happening place again. And they saw that the economy was turning around and the industry was turning around, and they were happy to support Hitler. And when the war started, even though most of the population was in favor of the war, perhaps, even though some were not, but what they saw was that Germany was winning. And what happened in the first year and a half of the war was extraordinary. Germany was winning right and left at an incredible speed, something that had never been seen in the history of the world. Conquering countries in a couple of weeks, in a few weeks, astonishing speed. So the German people felt a very strong sense of pride. And from this perspective, they were happy to see what was happening, even though they may not have agreed with Hitler and his policies in 100% of the time. Yes?
Some of my Jewish friends perceive the situation in this country as an analogy to the pre-Holocaust situation in Germany.
Yes.
So the question I have for you would be, assuming that to be true, and that's an assumption now, what can we take away from the German and Jewish Holocaust of the World War II era as a lesson that we can take into this situation to help the Jewish people now, assuming that we are at some level of mortal danger, similar to then?
Are you talking about the U.S., no?
I'm talking about the United States and the, shall we say, flowering, that's a sarcastic word, of Islam in the world. Not just the United States, but all over. What can we take away from the Holocaust scenario that can help us, given the situation that some people perceive and I perceive today?
Well, from a U.S., I think we have to break this into two parts, because I personally don't see the situation here in the U.S. reminiscent of pre-war Germany in any way, shape, or form. Even though some Jews may be persecuted here in the U.S., the situation here is nothing like the situation in 1930s Germany, not even close. And the situation is pretty bad in Europe, though, and certainly in the Muslim world. But in Europe, I can probably start to agree with you a little bit more when we discuss Europe, because in Europe, anti-Semitism is on the rise. And anti-Semitism is, even though it's not the way it used to be in 1930s Germany, it is on the rise, and it's a pretty serious problem, and I think that has to be, we have to address it. And one way to do this is for the governments of the world, as well as the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, to do, as we were discussing earlier, to do something about it. And the thing that they need to do about this is they need to speak up. And they need to tell people in universities that want to divest from Israel, and they are fighting against certain Jewish organizations or cultural events, that this is wrong and this is not acceptable. So this has to come from the government.